This chapter is about human development. It's also called lifespan development, and we study from the moment of conception all the way through the stages of death and dying. It's a long one. I'm trying to get this done in 30 minutes, so let's go. Okay, this slide is prepping you for the rest of this module. It's basically talking about major themes in developmental psychology, like the famous nature-nurture controversy, continuity and stages, stability and change, and it's also defining what is developmental psych. Some of the things that you're going to be seeing in this chapter are cross-sectional studies, which basically compare people from different ages. What can a 2-year-old do? What can a 4-year-old do? What can a 6-year-old do? And then it also has some longitudinal studies, not as many though, and that's those. Look at the word longitudinal. It's long, right? These are maybe twin studies that they follow people from the moment they're born to like their mid-20s or 30s. That's a longitudinal study. So we'll be seeing a variety of different kinds of study in this module. So speaking of cross-sectional studies, check out this slide. Isn't it cool? These are different kinds of drawings from a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And it shows like the progression, like the evolution of how we improve our drawing over time. Here's an example of a longitudinal study. Same child being studied over 18 years of life, looking at their drawings, how it has, it evolved and gotten better as they get older. These are the questions that we did in class, and we're doing this for every module. We stop and we break down the research designs, and it asks you questions regarding research with the theme that you're studying currently. So here are the questions. Okay, so I started with the silly Avion commercial with babies, skating in diapers. This slide is giving us some really important information about birthing complications. So anoxia, lack of oxygen to the baby, this could happen, before birth or during the process of birth. Premature births are another complication where babies are born prematurely. They're at greater likelihood of physical and mental impairments. Teratogens are pathogens. It could be a virus, it could be drugs that affect the fetus. That's why when mom is pregnant, she has to eat super clean and stay away from all kinds of drugs, even the over-the-counter ones like your allergy medications or the common cold medications. Pregnant people can't really do that. They have to stay super clean. And FAS is fetal alcohol syndrome, another complication. That's when mom is drinking and she has alcohol throughout the pregnancy, and it actually causes premature birth, low birth weight babies, and they can have different issues like cognitive delays and physical impairments. Now, most problematic is the ectopic pregnancy. The ectopic pregnancy occurs when a fertilized egg grows outside of the uterus. Almost all ectopic pregnancies, more than 90% of them, occur in the fallopian tubes, and if that's the case, unfortunately, it has to have a termination. So ectopic pregnancy, another birthing complication, very serious one. Here I showed a video of the phases of gestation, and you have to know the order of the stages. It's the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the fetal stage. And you guys know that I like mnemonic devices, so if you have to think of who is the name of the baby's dad, think of Jeff, but with the G, G-E-F, germinal, embryonic, fetal stage. And then you'll always know the stages of the phases of gestation. This is the part of the module that you have to know all the baby reflexes. And so here I've provided pictures for you. That's a picture of the rooting reflex. And there's a picture of the palmar reflex where they do that little, death grip. The neck riding reflex to protect the spine. The walking stepping reflex is right above my head. And there's the Babinski where they splay out their toes. Isn't that cute? Now, All the reflexes are listed here, and there's a definition. You just have to know them. Sucking reflex just makes sense, right? It's so that they can feed. But the rooting then causes the sucking. So when they root towards whatever is poking them in the cheek. So if you have a little pacifier and you poke them right here, they're going to turn towards whatever is causing them to, like, getting their attention. That's the rooting. But then they will latch and suck vigorously, and that's how they receive nutrition. So remember the Palmer reflex, the Babinski Moro orienting, and there's others that we haven't mentioned, like the eye blink and the swallow and the breathing. But I mean, those are almost obvious, right? So these are the ones you have to know. These are the ones most tested. So maturation is the orderly sequence of biological growth that enables changes in behavior, and it's relatively uninfluenced by experience. So some of these things, they can be kind of hampered by adverse childhood experiences, like in the case of abuse and neglect. So remember, a child can be born perfectly perfect in every way, but then, right, the environment takes a toll and hurts the brain. It can cause all kinds of deficiencies. So just because someone's genetically viable and they're doing so well and they're born perfectly perfect, remember that having those negative environmental influences can hamper the brain's performance. Now this YouTube link above my head, this is showing you the still face experiment that I don't want you to do with your local baby, because this is kind of mean. And it distresses the baby, as you're going to see in this video. The baby gets distressed when mom does that frozen face. And what does this tell us? That tells us that babies crave stimulation. They need to be spoken to. They need to be, like, talk to, taken to places, and look and point, and you want them to engage with you. You can't just plop them in front of a television and expect them to mature and grow. It doesn't work like that. So there has to be engagement and there has to be stimulation. The still face experiment proves it. More evidence to suggest that babies need stimulation is the Rosenwig and Kretsch experiment, where they reared young rats in solitary confinement, and then some in what they called rat park. Now, the single rat that was raised in solitary confinement was given food, was given water, it was aided to live, but that's it. There was no engagement or interaction with this solitary rat. Yet the rats that were raised in rat park, they had all kinds of engagement with other rats. They did cool rat things. They were crawling and digging and climbing, right? They were, kind of like in their own natural habitat. When you look post-mortem at their brains, right, when you extract those little brains from their skull, the isolated rat had literally less brain tissue, less red corpuscles running through it. It wasn't as pliable. This brain was damaged. The isolated rat had that damaged brain. So we can just imagine behaviorally that's going to play out also. So remember that this was brought to you by this very important experiment, the Rosenwig and Kretsch experiment, that teaches us that babies, all babies, need stimulation. So to practice your research terms, when you look at the isolated versus the rat park rats experiment, right, you want to look at it from a research kind of perspective. Always try to identify what is the hypothesis, what is the IV, what is the DV, what are the controls, and try to examine it through the lens always of a researcher. The maturing brain rule is use it or lose it, and this is true pretty much for a lot of things, including our physical body. If you don't use it, you will lose it. This is including both fine motor development, like small muscles, fine motors like when you write, or gross motor development, like the larger muscles, like when you jump up in place, right? Those are gross motor muscles, all of which are influenced by the use it or lose it rule. Speaking of infants needing stimulation, there's a word here. Habituation. And habituation is decreasing responsiveness with repeated stimulation. This is why the baby's wallpaper is only going to excite them for a little while. We're talking maybe a couple of days. They'll look at the wallpaper with interest, but after a while, it'll decrease in responsiveness until they don't even see the wallpaper at all. So remember, if it's true for the wallpaper, it's true for toys, it's true for the mobile that's hanging above their head in their crib. They need it to be changed. So probably a good strategy is to change out their toys. Don't give them all their toys at once. Maybe change it out. So give them a few, then take them away, and a week later you could present the older ones that were there a week ago, present them again. They'll think like they're new. It'll spark up their interest. Habituation. It'll teach you a lot of like tricks and hacks on how to take care of babies. So one of the things that we learned in the brain chapter is that our frontal lobe isn't fully developed until you reach puberty or adolescence. And even then, it's there, but you don't really get good at using it. You're kind of a novice using it until you're older. Now, in this part of the module, it talks about physical development in adolescence and also how it changes into cognitive development of adolescence. Okay, in this part of the module, it talks about the nature of gender, and it talks about the genetics and the physiology, besides that. It talks about the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. Remember, the mother's is the X chromosome and the father's is the Y chromosome. And it's found only in males, and that's why the dad is the one that decides the sex of the baby. Remember that there is testosterone and estrogen, and you learned this in the brain chapter a few modules back. And testosterone, men, estrogen, women. When they talk about primary sex characteristics are the body structures like the ovaries and the testes. Secondary sex characteristics are the reproductive traits such as the female breast and such as the testicles in men. Okay, in this slide, we're talking about gender roles, the social expectations that guide people's behavior as men or as women. And here's a fun fact. Do you know that driving became a universal right for women in Saudi Arabia in 2018? 2018, that was like the other day. It seems crazy, right, that women just got the right to drive in 2018 in Saudi Arabia. Well, that's because of their culture, right? And their views on gender roles, what women should be doing and what men should be doing. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Just listen. When jobs are scarce, men should have more rights to the job than a woman. Do you agree or disagree with that? Well, just to let you know that in Spain and Sweden, 10% when surveyed said yes, that the man should have the job if jobs are scarce. Now, look at the stark difference. In Egypt and Jordan, 90% of people surveyed said yes, that the man should have the job and not the woman if jobs are scarce. So this all brings us to think about these themes of gender role and what does it mean in our culture. This is a really cute interview of little kids, and they ask them about typical gender roles. In this part of the module, they talk about the physiology of sex, and it has more to do with psychology than it does with physiology. So it talks about the psychology of sex and the different characteristics of teens who delay having sex. Okay, fill in your notes about gender and sexual orientation. There are several places in the notes you have to fill in. Do that now about gender and sexual orientation. You can't take developmental psychology without hearing the name Jean Piaget, famous Swiss psychologist that came up with really definitive cognitive development theories about children by studying his own children. And he came up with those two words, assimilate and accommodate, and I've done this before in a previous video. SS, assimilate, is same schema. You bring things into your own schema. Like babies bring things into their own world. Remember I talked about a set of keys? What do babies do with a set of keys? They're going to chew on them, they're going to put them in their mouth, they're going to bang on them, they're going to throw them across the room. That's what they do. They assimilate keys, but once they accommodate keys, the CC in accommodation is CC, think of change and create a new schema. Do you remember that mnemonic device? Accommodations when you give the baby the keys and they actually do stuff with the keys, like they stick it in a keyhole, or they put it like to unlock a door, or they pretend they're starting the car. That's when you know they have kind of evolved from assimilating keys, bringing it to their world, to accommodating keys, like changing to accommodate what they know that the special powers that keys can do. All right, so in the theory of cognitive development by Jean Piaget, he came up with different theories, and there's 4 stages, he said. The first one's called sensory motor, the second one's called pre-operational, the third one's called concrete, and the last one is formal operations. And we know that he really dropped the ball on the first theory, which is the sensory motor theory, where he basically said that babies didn't know anything, that babies were not smart, that babies that had no language, they were just kind of discovering what they do to manipulate things around them. He also said that between 4 and 6 months, they're going to produce results through physical activity, which is true. He also said by the year, they're going to remember that toys are not present, and he came up with the word called object permanence. But we know he dropped the ball because babies are so smart, and I'm going to show you a bunch of videos that will prove that they are smart. That's my dog begging for food. The second one is pre-operational. It's from the years of 2 to 7. And 7 years old is a really important time because that's when they are starting to emerge the concept of conservation. We'll talk about that in a second. And egocentrism is all that what they're about as kids. Egocentrism is when they think of themselves, but they don't think of anybody else, which is pretty typical of babies. Concrete operations is from 7 to 12, and that's when you're learning about conservation. And formal operations is kind of where you guys are now, but you guys are actually beyond that now. It's between 11 and 12, but you guys are past that puberty stage, and this is where you're able to really critically think using the frontal lobe, using, you know, hypothetical situations. You can dream up all kinds of scenarios. You are past the formal operations, but that's where he said that the big critical thinking comes in, and he was right about that. So he was right about 2, 3, and 4, pre-op through formal, but we know he dropped the ball on the first one, sensory motor. This is the theory of conservation. There's different ways you can do this experiment. As you can see in this chart above me, there's liquid conservation, there's solid quantity like you can do with Play-Doh, and then there's conservation of number where you can do with coins. And in class, I showed various videos where kids are asked these questions, and if they're really young, they get them wrong. Usually before the age of 7, they get them wrong, and it's okay. They're not ready. Their brain isn't really ready to understand conservation. People that threw Jean Piaget's sensory motor theory out the window. These people proved that babies were smart. Meltzoff and Borton experiment gave babies 2 pacifiers, one weird bumpy one and one like typical one. And the baby, when he put the weird one in his mouth, kind of spit it out and looked at it. But here's the cool part. When they held both pacifiers in front of the face of this baby, the baby stared longer at the unusual looking pacifier. Isn't that neat? Now Now this is a 1-month-old baby. Now if you don't know what a 1-month-old baby does, the answer is nothing. They just eat and sleep. So the fact that he's staring at this unusual pacifier really is interesting because, you know, Jean Piaget didn't think a 1-month-old can process anything, much less tell the difference between something that's typical and something that's atypical. Now, if you keep going down the line, you'll see Karen Wynn did some more experiments with babies, and she has a baby lab. And in the baby lab, she talks about how smart babies are. And I have a bunch of videos to show you in class, and you can watch them at home on YouTube, that prove that babies really are smart. Lev Vygotsky did the zone of proximal development, or ZPD range. And I have a really cute video that shows you a little bit about that. Now, one of my favorite experiments is the theory of mind Sally Ann test. And this is to try to see if kids can kind of put themselves in the kind of like the mental state of another person. And that's called theory of mind. And this is the Sally Ann test. And you can see the test right above. If you go to that YouTube link, it's there. You know, you can't speak about cognitive development without mentioning how we develop our sense of morality. And Piaget had said when kids are little, they're very egocentric, they're totally self-centered. All they think about is themselves, and they really almost can't help that. And that persists for quite a long time. But eventually they start developing reasoning powers, a sense of morality, a sense of intuition, and they're able to problem solve about like even social matters. So it's very interesting, like course of development isn't just physiological, it's also very psychological. In psychology, we also talk about delayed gratification, and we mentioned it in a prior chapter. It's here again. Delaying your gratification, you can't talk about that without seeing the famous marshmallow test by Walter Mischel. And I want you to, when you're looking at this video and you're looking at them staring at the marshmallow, I want you to practice delaying your gratification with your cell phone. Pretend your cell phone is that marshmallow. Can you try not to touch it? Can you try not to look at it? Can you put it away maybe while you're studying? Half an hour, you know, set a timer, put it in a drawer, and then have the timer go off in 45 minutes or a half an hour after you're studying. That's delaying your gratification. Can you do it for 90 minutes while you're in class? Can you? The more mature you are, the more likely you're going to say yes to that answer. Okay, so this is the part of the module that starts to evolve into language and language acquisition. And we're going to start by talking about what is the basic unit of sound. It's a phoneme. And when you put phonemes together, you make morphemes. Think of phonemes sounds like phonics, they're sounds. And morphemes are meaningful combination of those sounds. M for morphemes, M for meaningful combination, does that help? And then you put them together and you make words. So when you talk about English specifically, you know, the English language has 26 letters that produce over 100,000 morphemes. There's over 7,000 human languages. And so that's a lot of language learning very, very fast. Have you ever noticed that? That's a lot. Now, all languages have like aspects of semantics. They all have a vocabulary. They all have a sense of grammar, right? How you put the vocabulary together. And a linguist named Noam Chomsky once said that it's too miraculous the way we learn language so quickly, that there's something special about us, maybe about our brains, that we acquire language so incredibly fast, faster than if we were actually being taught a language. Because think about it, but by the time you get to pre-K, you know a language, like you're speaking in sentences, and they might not be grammatically perfect sentences, but they're pretty good sentences, and you're conveying and you're expressing what you want. That's kind of amazing. How did that happen so fast? We are wired to learn language. Probably the hardest part about learning a language, and some people are, you know, I have students that are trilingual. I have students that know 4 or 5 languages. It's really amazing. I just happen to know 2 languages. I'm bilingual. And the hardest part about learning a language is the pragmatics of the language. It's kind of like the social purpose of language, because anyone can learn a language, like textbook learn a language, but really learning a language, infusing yourself in the language, you got to infuse yourself into the culture. And pragmatics is the way we use language. It's kind of like, let's take a normal greeting like hello. Well, like, it wasn't that long ago that kind of a popular slang term was hello, like hello, you're an idiot, like knock knock, nobody's there, like hello. The way I change my face and the way I change my tone when I say the word hello changes the meaning of hello. And it's just like sarcasm, right? If a kid falls down and you say, good job, kid, like that's not appropriate, right? Like the kid falls down, the first thing you should say is, are you okay? You know, do you need help? You know, that kind of thing. But if a kid falls down, you go, good job, that's sarcasm. And if you're an American, you are well versed with sarcasm. A lot of our humor has to do with sarcasm. So think about it. When you say good job, kid, that's kind of like the pragmatics of the language. Like most people will understand I'm using sarcasm. Most people will know that's not a good job when you fall down. Pragmatics, that's the hardest part about learning a new language. Have you guys heard of the bilingual effect or the bilingual advantage? Have you heard about it? Well, if you haven't heard about it, here's what they're talking about. For many years in the past, pediatricians, right, would tell parents, well, if the speech is slow, cut out that second language, stick to one so they can keep up with their peers, right? They're no longer saying that. At least they're trying not to. And unfortunately, I still hear doctors saying this to other people. But it shouldn't be, because now we understand. The bilingual advantage says that bilingual kids, because they're processing two languages at the same time, instead of the monolingual kid who's only processing one language, you know, currently, they might start off slow, but then once they master it, they take off. By the time they're 2 years old, they know that grandma over here only speaks Spanish, and they'll say things like, abuela, yo quiero leche, or they'll say, mom here only speaks English, mom, I want milk, and they know which person to speak what language to. And do they make mistakes? Of course. Sometimes they'll chop it up and they'll say, mom, I want leche, and they'll say part of it in English, part of it in Spanish. And remember, fill in the blank to whatever language you want to talk about, because I'm just using Spanish as an example because that's my experience, but you might be talking about Italian, you might be talking about Japanese. It doesn't matter what language is the second language. The fact is, bilinguals, they learn it, they might start off slow, but then they take off like a rocket and they do amazingly well. Have you ever heard a cute little baby babble? Well, in class, I was showing these little babies babbling to each other. They're so cute. Babbling are also known as spontaneous utterances. They're just early sounds produced by the baby. And you know what? All babies babble. It doesn't matter what language they're exposed to. They all babble the same way. Now, motherese, it used to be called motherese. Now it's called parentese. And parentese is that high-pitched tone of voice that parents use usually when you're talking to a cute puppy, but you do it also with a baby, and your pitch goes super high. Like I know for me, I'll be like, oh, you're the cutest little baby, and I hit those crazy high octave notes that only dogs can hear, and that is parentese, also known as motherese. You should kind of have an example or kind of an idea of when babies do what, and you should just know that by the time you're 1, you should be in the one-word stage, where you're using one word very meaningfully. By the time you're 2, you're in the two-word stage. You're using 2 words, you're stringing them together to convey greater meaning. Now, the theories to explain language, the 2 predominant theories were operant conditioning and imitation, and we can't deny that that takes, you know, a huge kind of role in language acquisition. We copy, right, that's imitation, and then we're rewarded. Like when we say something right, mom will say, yay, very good, and then we'll say it again, right? That's typical. Of course, that's part of it. But then how do you explain how kids invent their own language? How do you explain when kids make up words for their own language? And how do you explain how kids get it so fast and then they make these grammatical errors, and then they're learning rules but they use them wrong? That's the predominant theory doesn't hold true. It can't just be operant conditioning and imitation. Innate mechanism is kind of it's also known as the language acquisition device. It says that your brain is wired to learn language, and it's wired to acquire language very, very quickly. Thinking affects our language, but our language also affects our thinking. And linguistic relativity, linguistic determinism, it's like how language influences the way we think. And there are several studies, and I'm going to show you a few clips of YouTube videos that talk about linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. Quick review: when we learned about the brain way back when in another module, do you remember Brokaw's and Wernicke's aphasia? Brocaw is how we speak, and Wernicke is how we listen and understand, and aphasia is an impairment here. And so here's a couple of examples of that. This is not just a pretty picture above my head. Study this, and it's color-coded for a reason, because you have to know the social emotional development across the lifespan from infancy to childhood. This picture is going to help, so study this. Harry Harlow did the famous surrogate mother experiment, where he took rhesus monkeys away from their natural-born mothers and he provided them with a wire surrogate. And it's really, really sad, but he did prove that attachment is correlated to something that we all call nurture and love. After you watch the video of those cute little Harry Harlow monkeys, it makes you so sad, right? And here's what they learned from doing this: that nurture is really important. Exploration and attachment are related, and babies will get the courage to explore through attachment. The better attached they are to their caregiver, the more likely that they're going to go out and thrive and become independent people. Can't talk about attachment without talking about Konrad Lorenz and his famous critical period and imprinting. And he said as soon as babies are born, they imprint on their moms, just like the little ducklings did for him. Little ducks and little geese followed him around because they imprinted on him. And he said, gosh, if this is true with this species, couldn't it be true with human species? And he says right away, after a mom gives birth, that baby goes right onto mom's skin-to-skin contact. Let the bonding begin, because the attachment starts there. You know who else studied attachment? Mary Ainsworth. And she studied the very famous strain situation test, where she put babies in a strain situation, and then she would see how when the mom would return from the strain situation test, how the baby received the mom. And she determined that some babies had a secure bond and some babies did not, unfortunately. And so I'm going to show you in class a couple of examples of secure bonds and insecure bonds. I know this chart is pretty, but it's not decoration. You need to study this. These are the insecure avoidance, insecure resistant, and insecure disorganized. And then you have the top one, which, you know, it's good to note that 60% of her sample were secure. Everybody else was some version of insecure. But know this chart and know the attachment and then the side effects, like what happens as a result of this good attachment or bad attachment process. And talking about all this attachment stuff, what happens when we send our kids to daycare? Or did you go to daycare or preschool? Does that ruin your attachment or bond with your parents? And here's the good news, the answer is no. According to Sandra Scar and Jay Belsky and John Balby and a lot of researchers, there's been a lot of studies on this, and the answer is no. If it's so long as it's good quality daycare or pre-K and the kids are not there for too many hours, the bonding is fine with parents, and you can still have a nice tight bond with your parents. But remember, the ratios have to be low. That makes it a good quality daycare or preschool, and also not too many hours. They shouldn't be there more than they are with their parents. Oh, the parenting styles. Put your parents in one of these categories. Are they authoritarian, expect total obedience? Authoritative, they allow flexibility and negotiation. Permissive, they act more like your friend. They're unrestraining. And or neglectful, right? They're uninvolved, totally neglecting. And newsflash, there's one here that's highly recommended by psychologists, and the answer is it's number 2, authoritative, combining limits with negotiation. All the other 3 are too extreme, and it leads to bad outcomes and maybe even bad feelings between the caregiver and the child. Another pretty chart that's not decoration and you have to study. This is Eric Erickson's stages of crises. Look these over, know the order, and especially know where you are, right? A lot of times we learn things because we attribute it to ourselves. So check out the adolescence, which is identity versus role confusion. Check out early adulthood, which is intimacy versus isolation. A lot of questions might center around what they perceive are questions that are close, near and dear to your heart, because it's kind of like the stage that you might be in. The one that you probably heard the most of is the midlife crisis, which is middle age, generativity versus stagnation. And I'm sure you've heard of the midlife crisis, the stereotypical midlife crisis for men and for women. And it's on here, it's on this chart, so know it. At this part of the module, they do talk about social emotional development across the lifespan, namely with identity, finding your identity. And this happens around the time of adolescence. So they talk about the social identity, and they also talk about identity formation happening in stages. So check it out. Self-esteem and self-image is a very popular discussion in psychology, especially from the humanistic perspective. And you have to kind of understand how self-esteem works. Where do we get it from? And a quick answer is your parents don't give it to you. Life gives it to you, right? Like as you're trying things out in school, as you're trying and attempting new things, taking a test, trying out for the cheerleading squad, trying to make the basketball team, life kind of teaches you. You're good at this, you're not good at this. You scored here, you ranked here, and that's where you get your self-esteem. Self-esteem comes from reality. Heading towards the end of our study in the development chapter, they do talk about the stages of death and dying, and it does talk about a topic that as Americans, our culture really tends to fight. We don't embrace death, we fight it. We fight aging, and we fight the idea of getting sick and dying. We fight it tooth and nail. We don't accept it. And that's not true for all cultures. Now, here's what you might have heard about the stages of death and dying. They're also called the stages of bereavement. And here they are, the stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And just remember, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with these, and there is no really strict order that these occur in. Even in her studies with many hospice patients, she noticed that people do go in through the stages, but they might not hit a stage, they might not stay in a stage, and it might not be in the order that it appears.